Hello, this is Kelsey. I have relocated to Berlin, and there's probably an ideal setup for doing video content in this room. I just happened to not have found it yet. But that is not why you're here. You're here to talk about the theoretical Rift rivals between the European LCS and the League of Legends Pro League in China. Now, when we last left off, G2 took down Royal Never Give Up in round 1. Now, I promised we'd do Fnatic versus EDG next, and then the final would be UoL versus WE, but this past week I saw a new side of Fnatic and the Splice series that showed me that they kind of understood the meta a bit more, they have more flexibility, and I really feel like, and probably a lot of other people watching, especially with the UoL NIP series also going on, that Fnatic are going to be EU's best representative. Like, it feels pretty definitive. I mean, probably we'll get to Rift Rivals now, and EU will just have this weird makeover where it turns out G2 are at the top again, and then UoL is the second best team, and Fnatic kind of just like screwing around or something. Who knows? But right now it feels like Fnatic are going to be the strongest representative, so I'm going to do the scramble a little bit, and we're going to talk about EDG versus UoL first instead. So I lied to you a little bit. But since I said I wanted to do or have some element of the King of the Hill format as well in these videos, we're going to talk about G2 as well. So, next up, assuming G2 advance, they would face EDG next by this metric. I actually kind of favor EDG a little bit, and I think if you take into account the fact that G2 are still struggling and EDG look a lot better with the playmaking support meta in vogue, the fact that Clearlove 7 is back, I think it's pretty easy to make a case for that. I mean, it's not demonstratively easy to say, because I think if we talk about the G2 that was at MSI and the EDG in Spring Split, it would be really, really hard to say, okay, EDG win this, because they looked terrible. But I think we have a little bit of a reversal of circumstances now, and I'm going to get into that as I'm bringing out a little bit of info on EDG and as we keep discussing that. Some of you probably already know Clearlove, or Clearlove 7, is back to playing for Edward Gaming, and what this means is that they've become a little bit more telegraphed, but definitely defined. So I don't want to recommend EDG just based on the fact that Clearlove is back, because we know he has the controversial history. He is a little predictable in that regard, but I think in this particular case where G2 are really struggling, it really, really helps them to have a defined identity and a defined way that they're looking at things. Clearlove 7 looks to have pressure in the bottom lane really early. Sometimes if there is a threatening support pick that does invade or something like this, EDG are just actually happy to split the map in half and take the bot side. So to do the vertical jungling style, as a lot of people like to refer to it, he'll telegraph doing really early ganks. And I think it's a lot of it is Mako as well, who is the new EDG leader and shot caller, who actually even will go out of his way to say, you know, if we aren't getting that first bot turret before 10 minutes, it's a failure of a game. Edward Gaming have done these really, really obvious, everyone's going to be bot at level 6, everyone's going to teleport types of team compositions. Snake have even answered with really, really weird versions of their own. The point is mostly that, you know, Clearlove will telegraph this, he'll start Raptors on red side and then go blue buff instead of going Raptors red, just so that red buff won't be up when he's bot and things like this. So it's just really easy to tell what EDG is going to do. That's not the criticism. The point is that when you talk about G2 esports, they've been picking like weak sort of bottom lanes, and Sven has said that they might move away from that, but it's something that they have kind of been relying on a little bit, or kind of crutching on while they figure out the meta. Just these comps that scale really well, but EDG will prioritize picks that will crush bottom lane early. They'll get that first tier turret, and then they want to move really, really quickly to top lane. They want to move really, really quickly to mid lane and get as many turrets as possible. And sometimes this can hurt their resource distribution, but it's something that I think NIP have shown has been effective against UoL, that I think can be effective against G2, because like Fnatic have had success with this kind of play. G have also kind of prioritized the 2v2 mid a little bit more this season than they have in the past, and that's something that, as we talked about in the last video, aligns a bit with G2. So it could come down to this 2v2 sort of setup, but I think what EDG do with their leads is actually really, really decisive and really, I guess, well planned out. So if they have these tiny item advantages, they will look for skirmishes and jungle entrances that they can take advantage of while behind, things like this. So you have, gosh, I really need to stop saying that, you guys are right. So if they have an advantage like a Sheen on a Corki, this is a very small power spike, or a BF sword over a completed item like a pickaxe, or just maybe a vampiric scepter on the enemy AD carry, then they will take advantage of that aspect and look for skirmishes in jungle entrances and to take these objectives. And this is where EDG kind of spike as a team, just a little bit outside of the 10-minute mark. But the main focus of this video is supposed to be UoL versus EDG, not EDG versus G2. So if you kind of opt into the idea that EDG would best G2, or whether you do or not, let's talk about the UoL matchup and how they deal with it. I think something that's interesting about UoL, people will point out that they might take weaker laning matchups or look for these types of plays with more scaling picks, but I think what's really interesting is despite that, they are constantly looking for ways to pressure up or to push up in the lane, even in weak matchups, and I think this is a big reason why you have Exile with the really, really high solo death statistic, or why you see Semix and Hylissang getting caught out so much, and why UoL can fall behind so easily. So again, this would put a team susceptible to sort of the way that Edward Gaming like to play. If they're pushing up in weak matchups or looking to play aggressively in weaker matchups, then you have Edward Gaming's jungler present, and there are a lot more opportunities for Exile and Semix and Hylissang to get caught out like this. So I think that this is a bit of a worry point. Now, of course, when you look at Edward Gaming and you look at LPL as a whole, you know that in the context of the region, minion control is very poor. So the fact that you kind of are even looking to these minions at all, that G2 have actually a very strong understanding of how to stack waves and how to keep this push flowing, even in poor matchups, or how to deter dives to an extent, that could pose a bit of a problem. But I do think the presence of the jungler and just the general aggressiveness in the weak matchups will be enough for EDG to punish this tendency, especially if you have Clear Left 7 kind of ping-ponging between mid and bottom. And this is where I will criticize Unicorns of Love a bit and their understanding of early game flow. I think that Xerxes has a tendency to pick more scaling picks, and even when he does go for some of these early junglers, he'll go for matchups or for ganks that are easy given the terrain, because, for example, Rek'Sai, top lane ganks, really, really easy from red side. But even in this scenario, if you take a look at the map, it's not the ideal lane for him to pressure, right? The Rumble Gragas matchup. It would be more ideal for him to try to keep the Lucian from getting complete control of mid lane, or more ideal for him to look at bottom to put down the Twitch and to start giving this Caitlyn the scaling advantage. So you aren't going to get a lot of return out of getting Vizicsacsi super ahead on the Gragas, and he's doing this just kind of for ease of the map, and that's not the only factor you consider in what lanes to gank. He also might leave the bottom camps up, and this type of experience susceptible to an invade scenario, especially if the mid lane is ahead. So I think that that's something that you can kind of look at UoL for, is their poor understanding of dives, their poor understanding of when to use and where to use jungle pressure given the flow of the map. So it feels a little bit like Edward Gaming should be able to get these types of advantages, follow maybe the NIP blueprint, the fact that they have a pretty understanding concept of early game flow, that they emphasize these bottom advantages and look to get leads there in a scenario where Unicorns of Love don't necessarily prioritize advantages. But let's take a look at where NIP messed up. If you look at the way that NIP have their flanking ward set up, they more or less don't have any on their backside, where Unicorns of Love could set up a collapse scenario or a way to flank on them. Any of these types of instances. So this is a really, really big mistake that I feel like a lot of teams in Europe make against NIP, is that they don't check for these types of scenarios. And Unicorns of Love, they love to bring a lot of engage. They love to bring you Gragas, they love to bring collapse champions like Hecarim, like Tahm Kench, and these better scaling picks, like Corki has gotten a lot better at scaling up from behind. Like, Caitlyn is pretty good at scaling up from behind. And even look at this opening of the fight, right? They burn very big key ultimates just to try to zone out the Caitlyn. They don't have really any idea where the rest of Unicorns of Love are on the map, and they make this kind of mistake, this kind of error. So Unicorns are just happy to take disadvantaged fights here if NIP make a mistake like this. And that's one of UoL's biggest comeback mechanics. Their biggest mechanisms for succeeding in games, and you know that it's going to happen. You know it's going to happen. And this is the question that we have to ask is, are Edward Gaming able to avoid this kind of scenario? Can they set up a little bit better than NIP did in this? Okay, let's look at a similar push where Edward Gaming group mid to take out this turret. First, you notice that they're doing it in response to vision of RNG on the bottom side of the map, going for this bottom tier 1 turret. So already that's a better play. Then you look at the fact that they have control of the top and bottom river. So they're very diligent about when they're going to siege or when they're going to look at an objective about moving this type of vision line. They understand that they're against Royal Never Give Up's long range engage from Kled, from Talia, and they don't want to take that chance of a collapse or of the map crashing down on them, so they have very thorough coverage on the river, they have very thorough coverage on either side, and I think it just works out a lot better. It's not something that you see as much against Unicorns of Love, and it's something that can kind of counter what Unicorns of Love like to do. Now, Edward Gaming aren't going to do this every time. They make mistakes, all teams make mistakes, but I think it definitely hampers their comeback mechanic that we see Edward Gaming understanding how to set up against these types of long-range engaged compositions. That doesn't mean it's all smooth sailing for Edward Gaming. I still think they really struggle to play around topside or to trade sides for top. In particular, you see kind of a really confused reaction to this bottom play when they tried to go for topside. They're trying to send their bot lane to answer mid and to release some of the pressure mid, but it's really not effective when RNG have so much of a tempo advantage, so I think that Edward Gaming are really, really contingent on getting this type of bottom lead and getting these types of scenarios where they can control the minion wave a bit more uncontested. So I think that that's really the troubling moment. That's really the aspect, because we have seen Unicorns of Love create these scenarios where they're pushing mid and they're pushing bottom if you group to make a play on top side, or if you group to make a play on another lane. And I think that that's definitely where you can see Edward Gaming fall down a little bit, but I still think ultimately Unicorns of Love aren't naturally going to pick things. Like, we've seen Unicorns of Love backed into a corner. We've seen Unicorns of Love in scenarios where they've lost a game with a massive deficit, and they're still going to stick to these picks. They're still not going to be afraid of your aggressive bottom lane style. So I think that in general, we're going to see Edward Gaming get the spot lane advantage just much more easily. For me, the thing that really kept Edward Gaming down at Worlds wasn't Clearlove choking, wasn't any of these sorts of really unexpected losses to Brazil or something like this. I think it was the loss of the playmaking support meta and the fact that we weren't seeing the Alistars, we weren't seeing the Tahm Kenches, we weren't seeing things like this as much in vogue. I think that was really the thing that hurt Edward Gaming, and now that we're seeing these Brahms, these Tahm Kenches, these Threshes, much more back and more coherent. We'll see Mako and Clearlove having a much more Vice-like control over the bot side, and that will help them a great deal, even if their AD carry isn't as high up on the list or isn't as strong as it was last year. And I think that that's the mechanism that will propel Edward Gaming forward against a really struggling G2. I think that G2 in proper form, or G2 in the last meta, would really easily take advantage of some of Edward Gaming's holes and gaps, the fact that they overgroup sometimes, and Unicorns of Love just have not really a lot of care for how far ahead they get in bottom lane. They will push aggressively regardless of matchup, and these are all abusable aspects, so I think that this is really Edward Gaming's condition. Can we free up the bottom lane early? Can we take out these first tier turrets? Can we set up river control on either side so that we can get the push mid, so that we can control Baron, so that we can control the red side, red buff area, and look for these better collapses, look for these better pushes. And I don't think that Unicorns of Love in their current form are going to be either well prepared enough, because Rift of Rivals is kind of a casual event when we get right down to it, or they're just going to be a little bit stubborn. They're not going to adjust to some of these really, really high damage picks. G2, I just am not convinced by their form right now. I think we've pointed out a lot of their holes, a lot of their struggles in the meta, the fact that they are kind of in a position where it's in case of emergency break hyper carry box. And I'm just feeling a lot stronger about G2, Edward Gaming, excuse me, than either of these teams. So I think that because of that, we actually see aspects of a more competitive Rift Rivals. So this episode was kind of interesting and fun to make. I think it still could go the way of either G2 or UoL. This is a pretty competitive trio in my head, but this is who I see advancing. Who I see taking out G2, who I would see taking out UoL in this King of a Hill format. So yeah, woo, round 2 goes to China, and we'll see who takes out round 3 and the theoretical Rift Rivals tournament tomorrow.